This is your Thursday Daily Delivery. I am Michael Rand. Excited to be back with you again today. We got so much to get to. Chris Hine will join me in a little bit, talking a little bit of Timberwolves off-season stuff. Good time for that. Discuss that ahead of free agency, ahead of the NBA really kicking into their off-season gear, and really before things really start to heat up next week on the field and on the on several different platforms and different sports. So I'll talk to Chris here in just a little bit. We kind of go back and forth on a Ben Simmons trade notion, whether we think that's a good idea or not. Had some fun with that. Get to a little bit of a wild news. We had Sarah McClellan on yesterday's show. She kind of foreshadowed what were the likely outcomes of the expansion draft, but we know now what happened. Carson Soucy, chosen by the Seattle Kraken in the expansion draft on Wednesday, and what does that mean for the Wild? But first, what did I miss? We got to talk some Twins here because there's kind of three little pieces I want to get to relating to the Twins. The first being they won against the White Sox, not terribly important in the big picture, but they did manage to split that series after, probably disappointing. They let a couple games that were, available to them get away. Could have had a better outcome in that series, even if that probably wouldn't have mattered a whole lot in the big picture. But they do get the win on Wednesday. The bad news is they find out that Alex Kirilloff, their rookie outfielder, first baseman, going on the injured list, going to have wrist surgery. Been a problem he's been having for a while. Just another thing for this season, right? If the promising things they seem to get going. When Byron Buxton's on the field, he's great, but he can't stay healthy. He comes back for a couple games and gets hit in the hand, and he's out. Kirilloff, same thing. He's been battling this wrist thing for a couple years now. They thought he could try to play through it, but it sounds like it's impacting his swing to the point now where he is going to have surgery. Won't be back on a major league field this year. So that's more than 2 months now that Alex Kirilloff won't be playing. Obviously some outfield openings, things like that. Wonder if we'll see a little bit more of the Jake Cave experience now that he's been rehabbing in St. Paul. And how those at-bats get divvied up. Maybe more Miguel Sano on a regular basis at first base, since Kirilloff had been playing a lot of first as well. We'll have to see. Probably opens the door for some prospects to come up too. But with the trade deadline looming a little over a week away too, we'll see how many more people join those new prospects if they're going to arrive soon. But Kirilloff definitely a big blow. Just not getting a chance to see him for a couple more months, seeing what he can do on the field. But the good news is he looks like he's legit. Looks like he can play and get the surgery done now. No sense trying to play through this year with discomfort and jeopardize hurting it more, or having the surgery and rehabilitation from that dragging into the 2022 season preparation. So might as well get it done now. But tough break for the Twins. The bigger piece of the Twins that I want to talk about is Shohei Ohtani coming to town starting Thursday. 4-game series between the Twins and Angels. I don't know how much you guys have been paying attention to West Coast baseball this year, or what Shohei Ohtani has been doing this season, but it is nothing short of remarkable. I mean, it boggles the mind what he's doing this season. You go on Baseball Reference, you look at his numbers, you got to look at the pitching and the hitting. He's got a combined WAR of 6.1 this season. Usually you look at offensive WAR and defensive WAR. You got to look at the pitching WAR and the offensive WAR for him. He's got 74 RBIs, 34 home runs. He's slugging over 1,000. Leads the league in slugging and home runs. Huge year pitching. Yes. Let's see. Decision wise, not only decision wise, he's only 4-1, but in 73 innings, just 95 strikeouts, only 49 hits allowed. Not officially listed as a starter yet for pitching-wise this weekend in the series, but there's a TBD on the Sunday starter for the Angels, and it sure looks like, Ohtani pitched on the 19th. That would be 5 full days of rest. If he pitched on the 25th on Sunday, that would make a lot of sense. So hopefully the fans at Target Field get to see him pitch. It's a little kind of nice when the pressure's off. When the Twins are playing better, I guess you wouldn't necessarily want to see Ohtani face them, because that might mean a loss. But in this case, just go enjoy that, assuming he is going to pitch in that game. Nothing short of remarkable. I can't really fathom how he is doing this, the mental energy, the physical energy it takes to excel in both of these facets at the highest level of baseball is nothing short of remarkable. Almost as remarkable as the Angels somehow still not being above 500 despite having Ohtani having this season, having Mike Trout on their roster. I know Trout's been injured for a while this series on the 60-day DL, but even when Trout was in the lineup, the Angels were only 17-19 this season. How do you have two of the best players in the whole world and still you cannot compete in a more meaningful way than that? But I guess it goes to show it's more than an individual sport, but this individual especially should go watch him if you get a chance this weekend at Target Field.
I'm Chris Hine, Timberwolves beat writer at the Star Tribune and the first 5-time guest in daily delivery history. Thank you for listening to this podcast. This work is made possible by our Star Tribune subscribers. For unlimited access to the articles mentioned in this podcast, our coverage of Minnesota sports from pros to preps, and even all of Rand's future blog posts about how the Timberwolves should trade for players they will never get, go to startribune.com/subscribe.
Special treat on Daily Delivery today. Chris Hine joins the show, 5-Timers Club. Chris, we've both been traveling so much this summer. I still haven't gotten you your jacket, but that's going to happen soon. Maybe at the Star Tribune picnic that's coming up, or if you're going to be at that, we'll make the swap and get you that. First off, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I've been spending the last few weeks visiting some family in Pennsylvania. I returned to Minneapolis this week, so I'm excited to come back to the desert that is Minneapolis.
Pack several water bottles, a compass. Make sure you can traverse this arid desert that we have. I don't want anything to happen. Make sure you've got plenty of. Stay hydrated is what I would say. It has been a hot summer. As I told you, it's not usually like this here in Minnesota. Yep. So
every winter and summer is not usually like this. In my 3 years that I've been here.
Quite a run you're on, Chris. But okay, so here's the premise for today. Chris texted me last week and said, I think we should do something. I want to make sure because you guys are probably going to read the headline of this show and you're going to be like, oh, Rand is on his Ben Simmons thing again. Chris texted me last week, said, I think we should do something on Ben Simmons and whether this trade whether the possibility of the Wolves trading for him is a good idea or not. So this is Chris Hine's idea. He cut the promo that we're going to use on today's show about wild speculation about players the Wolves and they're going to get. They'll probably never get Ben Simmons, but it's not a 0% chance because Ben Simmons is tradable and very likely to be traded. I think this offseason, better than 50% chance, I would think. And the Wolves at least are one of those teams that could put together a package of assets and have a need for a Ben Simmons. So right off the bat, Chris Hine, I want to give you the floor. Why? Let's talk about this idea of Ben Simmons in whatever context you want to bring it up. But let's preface it by saying you're not entirely sure the idea is even a good one, regardless of whether they could even pull it off.
Yeah, and maybe this is just me oversimplifying things in my basketball analysis and not really, haven't delved into the nitty gritty of the numbers and things like that. Obviously, he's a very gifted defender and is great in transition. Those are the undisputable facts about Ben Simmons. He will elevate this team's defense if by some chance they were able to acquire him. But when he can't be on the floor for the last couple of minutes of a playoff game because he's that much of an offensive liability, that's a problem for somebody on a max contract for me. I just don't see how this is a good idea, how it gets fixed. Again, maybe I'm being oversimplistic. Maybe I'm being short-sighted and just looking at what happened in this playoff series. But I just don't see how this roster starts crystallizing into a championship roster if he becomes one of the tent poles of it. Because they're going to have to give something up. I see the trade scenarios online and people are trying to get Simmons here without them having to give up McDaniels or Russell or I don't think they would have to give up Edwards, and they wouldn't give up Edwards.
Right.
But the fact that you might, just Beasley and Rubio and a couple picks might get Ben Simmons done is not a realistic trade proposal in my eyes. So I just can't imagine a scenario where you acquire a guy who was benched in the fourth quarter of key playoff games and is on a max contract and look at that and say, yes, that is our future right there. I just don't see it. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm being too simplistic, but I just don't see it.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and I don't necessarily disagree with the downside of Ben Simmons. The downside is there. It was on display in the playoffs. This is a very winnable Eastern Conference this year. I think, with all the injuries to the Nets, I think the Bucks have shown, in the playoffs certainly, and in the finals that they're a worthy team. But this was an East that was there for Philadelphia to take, and they couldn't even get out of the conference semifinals. Couldn't even beat a pretty average Atlanta team to get into at least a crack at getting to the finals. And that was largely because of Ben Simmons. I mean, let's be honest. I think Embiid played through his injuries pretty well. Harris was fine. I mean, the rest of the roster is a little bit, patchwork, but if Simmons has at least, if we even just see regular season Ben Simmons in that playoff series, which is like a 60% free throw shooter and a guy who, does all those other things, they probably win that series against Atlanta at least. That said, I think we saw the worst of Ben Simmons right now. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's not exactly who he is. Now he's not a great free throw shooter, even when he's not a historically awful free throw shooter, like 24 for 71, which I think he was in that series of those playoffs. He's a 60% career free throw shooter. And that's the thing that concerns me about him, is that his seasons haven't really gotten better. It's kind of been the same year 4 years in a row, and it's been fine. The first year he did it, it was great. It's like, wow, look at this guy. This rookie, and he's been relatively durable, even especially after the missing that whole first season with the foot injury. He's been pretty durable, but he kind of is what you see is what you get at this point. And so the question would be, is that enough, or do you think you can elevate him just enough, a little bit more, get him into being more like a 65 to 70% free throw shooter, make an occasional jump shot, just enough of a threat. I don't know. If you're acquiring him as is, if you're acquiring regular season Ben Simmons, no doubt he's a gifted but flawed player. That said, I think the player that you would be trading, the centerpiece of any trade for Ben Simmons, is probably, to make the money match, probably D'Angelo Russell, right? I think that's kind of...
I think that's kind of where I land, just in reading the tea leaves and things like that. It seems like that would be the thing. But is that the move you want to make? I don't know.
I think it kind of is, and I'll say that because I feel like a couple things have happened. One, I think the development of Anthony Edwards as kind of this combo guard who can handle the ball, and is kind of a little. Russell is a little bit of that too. He's more of a point guard, obviously, than Russell is, but he's a guy who likes to play off the ball too. Their three best players right now are very offensive facing players. They're not defensive guys. I think they have a little bit of a roster imbalance right now when it comes to the emphasis on offense versus the emphasis on defense. Now, maybe McDaniels and his continued evolution, maybe other kind of, fringe moves they could make would help with that. And you don't have to, sacrifice offense to go get defense. But I feel like a lineup with Towns, Russell, and Edwards is always going to have some defensive problems. Is maybe going to have a little bit of size problems, especially if you get Beasley in that starting lineup too. I feel like Ben Simmons is a better short-term and long-term roster fit than D'Angelo Russell. Even if everything they've said about Russell, even if everything they like about Russell is true, I think they've got enough scoring. I think they could use something else, and maybe that something else is what Simmons would bring.
I don't disagree with any of that, what you just said about the offensive facing roster. And I think they realize that. I don't think that getting Ben Simmons is necessarily the only answer to that problem. I agree 100% that my biggest question going forward with the roster as currently constructed is, will this team ever play anything resembling average defense on a night in, night out basis? To me, that is question number one of the next season in terms of a team development. That doesn't mean that there aren't other solutions out there to help fix that particular problem on the defensive end of the floor. Maybe without giving up D'Angelo Russell, without compromising too much of your offense. We've heard some rumors and seen some rumblings, and Roses has made no bones about the fact that he wants to acquire a 4.
Yeah.
And that the power forward position is priority number 1 headed into this offseason. And, they wanted John Collins at the deadline. We're kind of seeing that Atlanta is having a moment where they're going to have to make some tough decisions on this roster that just got to the Eastern Conference Finals. And one of the casualties of that might be that John Collins is a sign and trade candidate, because he's due a large contract. Whether he gets a max or not is to be determined. But I think that's kind of what he's angling for. But the Wolves have a lot of interest in that. If he were to become available in a sign and trade scenario, I don't think you would have to give up as much to get a John Collins as you would have Ben Simmons, despite Simmons' depressed value. So I would be very interested in a scenario like that, where you're looking at a guy like a John Collins and maybe identifying him as the potential sign trade or trade candidate that the Wolves potentially bring in here in coming weeks. Because again, Atlanta has some tough decisions to make, and he might end up being one of the guys that ends up going as a result of those tough decisions.
I agree. I think Collins is more realistic. He was, let's remember, he was my original fixation a few months ago at the trade deadline. It probably didn't make sense for Atlanta at that point, because was that when they started to get hot and there was like, well,
yes, it was right after the coaching change. They started playing well. They decided to keep him. They didn't make any moves in terms of selling people at the deadline. It worked out because they made it to the Eastern Conference Finals. It turned out to be, the right thing to do. But that doesn't mean that just because the Wolves missed out on him at the trade deadline, that they're not going to circle back and see, hey, how are things going over there with Collins? Maybe there's a deal they can make.
What do you think what's the market for someone like him then? I think we've kind of established that for Simmons, even at his depressed value, and I think that's another reason to maybe that move is attractive, is that you're kind of buying low on somebody, even if Philadelphia's going to kind of try to prop up his value, not just give him away. But what's fair value in either scenario? I think if we've kind of identified, like, D'Angelo Russell's kind of got to be the piece that goes back for Ben Simmons, because I think that's someone that Philadelphia would want, someone that could play well with Embiid, that would fit that roster pretty well. They'd be giving up some defense, gaining some shooting, some late game stuff that they would gain. What's the market for a John Collins? You think it probably starts less than a D'Angelo Russell, I would think.
Yeah, I would say maybe around there. It's a different skill set. I would assume you'd be giving up at least a first round pick, if not maybe 2. I don't know. And I guess some of that depends on what player are you giving back, what level of players or player. Does a third team get into the mix in a situation like that? I'm not sure what the machinations of that would be, but you're definitely sending out at least 1 first rounder, maybe 2. I would assume, but I'm not 100% certain. NBA trade values never cease to shock me when some of them come down the pike, when you see what guys are dealt for picks and what guys aren't. And, we thought for a long time that Andrew Wiggins would require multiple first round picks to get off of the Wolves roster. Turned out it was only 1. Remember those days?
I do.
Yeah. So who knows? But, and again, some of that depends on what player you'd be sending back in return.
This is a good point for me to remind everybody too, that, while Gerson Rosas is his own, he's his own person, he'll makes his own decisions. He does come from the Houston organization that it does have a first round pick this year, but before this year, it did not have a first round pick since 2015. Different organizations value first round picks differently. Some see them as assets to acquire things. Some see them as, things that you actually want to draft and develop. It kind of depends on what stage of your organization you're at. When the Wolves were picking first, obviously they were going to take Anthony Edwards, even though they did potentially explore trading that pick at the moment. But I don't think the idea of the Wolves trading future draft picks, even though they don't have a pick this season as of now, is out of the question, because that's kind of the school of thought that Rosas came from. That these are assets. If you think you're going to be good, a first round pick isn't as valuable as you might think it is. It might have more value in a trade than it does in straight up taking someone at number 23 or something like that.
That's 100%, and that's where I'm thinking as well in terms of just the philosophy of dealing these first round picks. And this gets into a little bit of the clock is ticking. Like let's face it here. It's going to be year 3 of the Rosas regime coming up here. There's new ownership coming in, not for 2 years officially, but there's new ownership coming in. Karl-Anthony Towns. The clock on whatever trade, the day that the Woj bomb drops and he's requested a trade, everybody fears that day is out there in the future, right? So there is at least a little bit more than a little bit of pressure to turn this team into a contending team now. And if that means that you have to give up a couple first round picks to get a guy you think can put you into the playoffs, then so be it. I think at this point in the franchise's existence, Rosas is very cognizant of what happened with the Jimmy Butler experiment a few years ago, and how that worked for 1 year and then blew up in everybody's face and kind of set the Wolves back from a roster construction standpoint for a few years. So I think there is at least a little carefulness that will go into not just trying to sell out for 1 year or one playoff appearance.
Right.
Whatever is done is going to have an eye towards the next 5-ish years. So, but there is pressure to finally turn this team into a contender after 2 fairly miserable seasons overall.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, it's good to remember that he said no shortcuts, essentially, is the quote that I remember. He doesn't want to take a shortcut. He considers the Butler trade a shortcut. But, again, acquiring someone like a John Collins or Ben Simmons isn't necessarily a shortcut if you're not trading, 3 young assets, if you're trading kind of like-minded for like-minded, or if you're trading a future asset that you don't feel is going to be worth that much if you're good. The Butler trade, blew up because, for a number of reasons, but the players that went out, Levine, Chris Dunn, and Lauri Markkanen, I think I would do that trade again. Just wishing that the outcome on this end was a little different. Talking here with Chris Hine. Chris, before we go, you mentioned the ownership change. There was just another little twist in that this week. What's the update on that?
Yeah, so the NBA has formally approved the first 20% of Mark Lowry and Alex Rodriguez's acquisition of the Timberwolves and Lynx. Kind of just the formality, the formal steps that they have to go through to close this. So for those that might be unaware, when Meyer Orbach, the minority owner, sued Glenn Taylor to try to put a stop to this in order to get his money out of this deal, we learned a lot about kind of how this process is going to take place, because a lot of this stuff had to get filed in court. So Lowry and Rodriguez are getting 20% this summer. 20%. Technically they have the option to buy another 20% in 2022, and then in 2023 another 20%. And it's at that 2023 sale that they would have 60% of the franchise and would become the controlling owners of the Wolves and Lynx. So this is the first step in that process. Their initial 20% buy-in just got approved by the NBA, should be closing officially in coming days here. And so that would officially make them part of the ownership group. Not controlling owners, that's still Glenn Taylor for the time being, but this is the first step in that process. And each of their subsequent purchases next summer or next year, and then in 2023, this also has to go through the same approval process that they just went through these last few weeks here. The NBA has to approve every step of this along the way.
Did that approval contain all the provisions for exactly where they're going to relocate the franchise, Chris?
I haven't heard that yet. I guess it's still a coin flip, Seattle or Vegas. I mean, take your pick. But yeah, the provisions. Yeah, clearly it states in there that the Minnesota Timberwolves will be moving within a year or something like that. Yeah.
By the way, Royce brought this up on Monday's podcast. How did Gary Bettman get the NHL to Seattle and Vegas before the NBA got back to Seattle and got into Vegas? That's a major upset when you consider those markets.
It's a good question. I don't know. Well, I guess leagues had always been hesitant to jump on the Vegas bandwagon for traditional gambling, point shaving reasons and things like that. But I guess the NHL just saw an opportunity there and was like, hey, if nobody else wants to go, we'll go and try to build a team and build a following there. And I think it's worked out pretty well for them in the NHL. And so same with Seattle. They see an opportunity there. They think I guess it could coexist with Vancouver just over the border there. But part of me wishes I was covering the NHL so that I could go to Seattle and Vancouver again on work trips.
Those are good trips. Definitely covered a lot of wild playoff games in Vancouver many, many years ago. That was a fun back and forth. Not as fun when they played back-to-backs in game 6 and 7 back in the day, home and away, by the way. But that was a story for a different time.
My days covering the Blackhawks, I have a lot of stories about, or a lot of jet lag stories, flying back and forth to California and things like that.
For the playoffs, why did they do that? It's craziness. Anyway, Chris Hine, great stuff. Appreciate you hopping on. I don't know if we're ever going to solve the Ben Simmons thing, but if it happens, we'll get back on here and debate whether it was a good idea or not. Until then, enjoy the rest of your time in Pennsylvania. We'll catch you soon, okay?
Sounds good, Mike. Talk to you later.
Let's finish with the cooler, the Wild defensive core, which got thinner last week when they bought out Ryan Suter. Got a little bit thinner again when Carson Soucy was selected by Seattle in the expansion draft on Wednesday. That leaves the Wild really with just three rostered defensemen right now under contract. I'm sure there's going to be some free agent additions. I'm sure there's going to be some, movement from the younger group to see who can stick in the lineup. Not like this is a finished product, but this leaves them in a little bit thin on defense, a position that's been so good in recent years. Now you're looking at Jonas Brodin, Jared Spurgeon, and Matt Dumba, a very good 3, by the way, to start from. As your only 3 right now. Here's Bill Guerin, the Wild GM, on Soucy leaving to Seattle in the expansion draft.
Well, it obviously stings. Carson's a great kid. A player that we had saw a lot of value in. His progression over the last couple of years was fantastic. When I first got here, we kind of had him pegged for Iowa, and he took a job. He stole a job, and he kept getting better and better. And, it's unfortunate, but those are the rules. And we knew we were going to lose a good player, and, it was Carson, and we wish him nothing but the best. He gave us some good years, and he's going to do fantastic. I mean, obviously it hurts our depth, but, we've got some work to do, and we got to fill some spots.
And that was Guerin talking to reporters afterwards. He's going to have a lot of work to do in coming years. I wrote about this yesterday on the Randball blog, but the Wild salary cap situation looks okay this year. They can fit those extensions for Fiala and Kaprizov well under the cap this year. But next year, 2022-23 season, when those buyouts for Suter and Parise start hitting the books hard, I think their cap obligations right now are already like $65 million, assuming extensions for those 2 key offensive players. They're going to be about $65 million with just 10 guys on the roster accounted for, and that's going to be a bind. They're going to need to be relying on a lot of young players, which is part of the reason I was a little surprised that Soucy was exposed. A defenseman that can play, that's under contract for a relatively modest contract. So we'll see how that all plays out. They obviously have a plan, and now it's Bill Guerin's turn to execute that plan. That'll do it for today. I'll have Randy Johnson on tomorrow's show, the football writer, not the pitcher. He is coming to us from Gopher Football, Big Ten Media Day. Going to talk a lot of Gopher football. Should be excellent to catch up with Randy on all that. Thanks for joining me here today, and we'll get you again on Friday.